On Earth, there are 6,500 spoken languages today, with Mandarin Chinese at the most known. But what happens when two people don't understand each other via spoken language? This creates an extreme communication barrier. Would music fill that gap between different spoken languages to communicate? How might music function as a language, if at all? Every culture in the world has spoken language, and every culture also has music. These two sides of human culture have some important similarities and points of contact. Perhaps the most obvious of these is the use of sound. William Bright says that not only does every person use the vocal sound in language and in music, but non-vocal sounds are also associated with both systems, often substituting for language in various types of signalings. Language relies on our musical capabilities. To begin with, our first steps towards learning language depends on its musical characteristics. Musical sensitivity is evident earlier, and we learn language initially through its musical features, such as pitch and rhythm patterns and melodic contour, features that infants attend to. Recognition of these characteristics is developmentally a prerequisite to learning meaningful language, says Kathleen Higgins from University of Chicago, claiming that to learn a language, our musical senses are necessary to comprehend the pitches and rhythm of words and phrases. In other words, language presupposes musical capabilities. The word infant is derived from the Latin word infans, which means not speaking. Based on this word, there can be a common assumption that the development of language is what lets toddlers or children become communicating living beings. This is not correct, since by observing the actual behavior of a baby, they can communicate before they even have language. Infants use other cues to communicate, such as mutual gaze with the mother or father, a cry, or facial expressions to communicate uncomfortable situations. At this point, it is where auditory receptiveness to different sounds starts developing and the infant starts distinguishing sounds. Some babies prefer female voices instead of a male voice. They start connecting to auditory and visual stimulus, finding a human face and connecting it to a voice. Therefore, using sounds as a form of communication with the other human. Lullaby songs within human voices are a preference for infants. Different human voice sounds or different musical pitch causes different reactions. Therefore, the infant is using its auditory stimulus as a learning tool to communicate. This might be suggestive of music being a language because it shows that from the time we were born, we have been able to recognize pitch, tone, and rhythm and understand it as a communication. Spoken language presupposes musical capabilities because to understand or even speak a language, you must understand the rhythms of pitches, plus the tone of the sound effects of the emotion within the sound. Recognition of these characteristics, such as emotion, indicates that music is a developmental prerequisite to learning meaningful language. The more one practices the instrument that makes the music, the better one will become with that specific instrument. The more one practices different verbal languages, the more proficient one gets. In many ways, music follows the same path of development as verbal language. First, one learns verbal language cues in response to a situation referred to the strengthening of behavior, which resorts from reinforcements. Verbal linguistic behavior can be conditioned and shaped by the same stimuli and reinforcement as nonverbal behaviors. Therefore, musical abilities are shaped in the same way as verbal language. By increasing the rate of responses, the behavior will more likely be more consistent. When learning to play an instrument, consistent reinforcement is the key to become proficiency in reading, writing, and the production of music. Secondly, learning music requires a lot of problem solving, such as why is the instrument not hitting the correct key? Are my fingers in the right place? Why is the sound not coming out as I wish it would? We use trial and error when learning verbal and musical languages. When producing a sound for the first time, by trial, we learn if the sound is how we need or we need to try again to better the sound. Therefore, verbal and music abilities can be acquired by trial and error. And thirdly, like verbal languages, music can also be attained by domain-specific learning. Domain-specific learning is acquired only by certain abilities, not all. Playing music can sometimes be very specific. Different instruments are played very differently. The flute lady cannot play the saxophone or the trumpet, can she? This is the same for verbal learning. Verbally, when switching from speaking English to a different language, one might switch the way you open your mouth or your tongue moves, or have more understanding in one language versus the other spoken language. Verbal and musical languages have specific codes or patterns that are specific to each, such as mathematics and computer languages are also written. As discussed earlier, just because humans are born non-speaking does not mean they can't communicate. A language is defined as a socially shared code or conversation system for representing concepts through the use of arbitrary symbols and rules-governed combination of those symbols. Example, sign language uses a common code, rules, and system to communicate expression. Writing and reading use also a common code and system. Type of speech and annotations also have a common code and system of rhyme and reason to why the voice would go up or down with that specific word. But the most intriguing is how music, all types of music, is structured the same way as language. The claim that music is a language has been made to the context of musical expression. It has been approached through the notion of significance of semiotics. It has been suggested by analysis of music as a formal structure, and it has been appealed in discussions of musical representation. So the creative articulations of imagination become our means to self-understanding. Works of the imagination speak to us in words or sound, movement or painterly image, so as to enable us to grasp the complexity and shape of our own interests with the world. To further back my takeaway, I'm about to use the basic definitions of verbal and musical languages to compare similarities in their function, such as the personal communication of feelings, stimulus, and information. It leads to further prove that verbal and musical language are alike when written, listened to, or produced by a human. The spoken languages we have today evolved over time, such as Latin and Spanish to Slovak and English influence. Music language has also evolved over time. For example, starting from the original African sound to Caribbean sound, then eventually transformed into what we call jazz today. You might notice that the commonalities of music and spoken language are shown in how they are spread around the world and evolve over time. When music is used as a language to solve global issues, the outcomes are very positive. An UNESCO newsletter let out in 2004 stated that music, the universal language, brings together members of U.S. and Iraqi orchestra. The article continues to talk about how many artists and peace builders claim that music is well suited for the work of reconciliating adversaries, because not only can it facilitate communication and understanding, but it can communicate and empathy across all kinds of differences. But now, let's go back. If there is any disagreement to what music expresses, there is at least a general agreement that music is intended to and does, through its form, its content, or both, produce us emotions and a way of communication. Clearly, it gives us stimulation and information. Use the factor of feelings and emotions being communicated through music from one person to another, it can show and further explain how music can be considered as a language. What I'm suggesting is that music is a language because music functions as a language in so many factors, and most important, how it can connect people in different cultures in spoken languages on a personal level. Therefore, from how it develops in our abilities to how it impacts our cultures and around the world, music should be considered as a language since it functions as such a tool for humanity. If music is used around the globe and a verbal communication barrier exists, then music can be used as an international language to break that barrier, because since music is an ubiquitous theme of humanity, it assumes a language of its own that is understood by all cultural dialects.